Jesus said, you've heard it said, love your neighbor, but hate your enemies. The first part of that is actually a quotation from the book of Leviticus. The second part is not found anywhere in the Old Testament. In fact, the Old Testament itself enjoins Jews, Israelites, to love their enemies. If you find your enemy's ox wandering away, you're not allowed to just let it go. You're supposed to take care of it. You're supposed to return it to him. Or if you find your enemy's ox that's fallen down under a load, you're supposed to help it back up and care for it. Proverbs tells us that we should do good to those who hate us. We should heap up coals of fire. Paul quotes this in Romans 12, but he's quoting from a proverb. David is a great example of this in his relationship to Saul especially. David is constantly being abused by Saul. He's pursued. Saul wants to kill him. David does nothing but good for his enemy. He fights Saul's battles. He doesn't stretch out his hand against Saul. He doesn't take vengeance against Saul. He overcomes evil with good. And that's what Jesus is teaching his disciples to do. Loving your enemies means doing good to them. Doing good to them is not necessarily doing what they want you to do, or something that is simply comfortable for them. Telling the truth to an enemy is a good act. It's an act of justice, but it might hurt your enemy. But that's what Jesus calls us to do. Just as we should love our neighbor and love our brother well enough to tell him the truth, we should love our enemy well enough to tell him the truth. Augustine applies this principle so far that he says, even certain kinds of public punishments, even sometimes the waging of war, is an act of love because it restrains your enemies from being even more evil than they could be. You're limiting their evil and so doing them good. This principle applies not just to interpersonal relations. That's the way it's often applied, as if we could love our neighbors love our enemies in everyday life, but in public life we could act out of hatred. Jesus doesn't operate with that kind of public-private contrast. I think Augustine is right. Public acts of justice, even public acts of punishment, should be done in love as acts of love, not only for those who are being protected, but even for those who are being punished, whose evil is being restrained. Loving your enemies, again, is not the same as doing what they want you to do. This is a kind of tactic, as we saw in the last video. The way we accept the slap and look for the second slap is a tactic that brings agency back into our hands and puts the one who slapped us on the defensive, as it were. And loving your enemies does the same thing. It disorients your enemy if you do good to him rather than treating him the way he's treated you. But again, Jesus isn't enjoining it. He's not commanding this simply as a tactic. In fact, Jesus gives the deepest possible ground for loving our enemies. The deepest possible ground is that we are acting like our Father. Our Father sends rain on the just and on the unjust. If we want to be perfect as our Father is perfect, then we too have to love our enemies and do good to those who hate us and abuse us. That's how the redemptive righteousness of God, the redemptive righteousness that is God's own righteousness, that is God himself, that's how it becomes manifest in creation as we carry out that righteousness and imitate the perfection of our Father, who generously gives both to the evil and to the good.